There are people out there who only care about one single thing in terms of image quality with lenses, and that is sharpness. These people apparently need lenses that are extremely sharp, even in the corners when shot wide open, because especially when you want to isolate the subject with wide open aperture, the sharpness at the edges and the corners is usually extremely important. And for this one enormously important quality, everything else is completely irrelevant to them. For exactly these people, this lens we are talking about today is probably very well suited. I will tell you how Canon's RF 24mm f1.4 L VCM performed for me. I'm David, you are watching DAVISION, and let's go. I also have to say here, once again, that all of this does not matter for whatever you achieve great results or not with this lens. That's not the point here. Your ability as a photographer decides how good your pictures will be with your equipment. And the newer gear only could help. But if someone tries to tell you that all of this, what I'm going to tell you, is not relevant, it's only about the result, then you don't need to buy expensive lenses with obvious weaknesses. Since Canon's RF 35mm 1.4 L VCM has already not particularly convinced me, I'm curious to take a look at the 24mm from the same series. But by the way, even if the 35 1.4 hasn't particularly convinced me, I bought one myself. Because unfortunately there's no other choice if you really want a slightly better 35mm for RF mount. And with the 24mm it's similar again. The RF24 1.8 STM alternative is not really an alternative for higher demands. It's not even weather sealed and it has this annoying STM motor and drives out when focusing. Is the 24 VCM much better? Let's see. First of all, it's much more expensive. 1,750 euros is 1,150 euros more than the 1.8 STM costs. Personally, I'm an absolute fan of this focal length. I really like 24mm for street, for casual shots while walking with the family, or even for astrophotos that I have achieved great results with 24mm 1.4 lenses. And there were so many moments when I missed my Sony 24mm 1.4 G Master after switching to Canon. Now Canon finally released a higher end 24mm for the RF mount at the end of 2024. The lens, like the 35 and 50 and the new 20mm 1.4, again uses the same lens housing. It's 99.3mm long, it has 76mm in diameter and a 67mm filter thread. We all know this by now. But the 24mm is slightly lighter than the 35 and 50 at 515 grams. And one has to give Canon credit, these lenses are pleasantly compact with an aperture of 1.4. Normally, only Sony could manage that otherwise, but Sigma's 24 1.4 DGDN is also quite small and lightweight. And these lenses feel high quality as well. Even though everything is made of plastic, they bring a very high quality handling with them. There is again the aperturing without clicks that only works in photo mode on newer Canon bodies if you want. There's again an AF/MF switch, a freely assignable lens button, a pleasant focus ring and the RF control ring at the front that you can also freely assign. And other than the 24 1.8 STM, the 1.4 VCM lens is sealed against dust and splash water, at least if you, like always, use it with a front filter as usual. And like the name suggests, for the autofocus is again a voice coil VCM motor used here. In case of the 24mm, it rattles at least less than with the 35mm. I still find the whole thing a little bit strange. For example, I also have Viltrox 35mm 1.2 for Sony here for testing with voice coil autofocus motors, and nothing rattles at all when the lens is turned off. Optically, the 24 1.4 VCM consists of 50 lenses in 11 groups and again has 11 rounded aperture blades to ensure round bokeh even when stopped down. The close focusing distance is 24 centimeters, but due to the wide angle focal length, you only get a reproduction ratio of 1 to 5.8. But let's take a closer look at the imaging performance of the lens. And when it comes to sharpness, there's absolutely nothing to complain about here. Quite the opposite. It's already exceptionally good at wide open aperture. That means 24mm, aperture 1.4. Absolutely top sharpness. That's great. Even at f2.8 you can only see minimal contrast improvements in the image center, and the sharpness at the very edge of the image becomes slightly bit better. But from aperture 2.0 the sharpness is perfect from edge to edge. In principle it's not different than the 35 1.4 VCM, which was also razor sharp, wide open, and I had nothing to complain about in this category. But let's take a closer look at the chromatic aberrations of this new lens. And here it gets really wild. Almost every hard contrast edge shines like crazy. Not only at aperture 1.4, no, also at f2.0, also at f2.8, and even at f4.0 you still see it. It's too intense for my taste for such an expensive prime lens. And that is all with correction profile applied and checkbox for chromatic aberration removal ticked. Why should I sugarcoat here? What absolutely bothers me about this is that I was once told that correcting distortion with a profile instead of optically is done because it results in less chromatic aberrations in the images than if the distortion was corrected with special lenses in the optical formula. I see nothing of that here. I would expect such chromatic aberrations from a 200 to 400 euros full frame lens from a third-party manufacturer like Samyang or Viltrox, but not from a 1,800 euros expensive Canon L lens. At some point the red ring stood for something else. There are also, of course, the longitudinal chromatic aberrations, so color errors in the foreground and background blur around the sharpness plane. But since the sharpness plane is already quite large in the wide angle with aperture 1.4 at normal distances, you only see this with semi-macro shots, and that's not the usual use case for this lens. But when it comes to bokeh, there are light and shadows. It's good that the bokeh does not show any strange contrast edges in my test setup. And towards the edge of the image, there are cat's eye to see, yes. But that was somewhat clear here. At least the shape is pleasantly uniform with this cat's eye. But again, there's something you simply do not expect from a modern prime lens at this price range. The bokeh circles are not completely clear and show light onion rings. Overall, this is very similar to the 35 1.4 VCM. But these problems in the test setup do not necessarily have to transfer in the photos in use in real world use. But unfortunately, I see restless bokeh again, especially in highlights or light shining through leaves in the pictures I took with this lens. But now let's get to the point that I generally cannot understand in terms of Canon's hybrid VCM lens line: distortion. As mentioned earlier, it was said that if lenses are calculated with a correction profile, fewer special glasses are needed to optically correct for distortion. And these special glasses can worsen the image sharpness at the edge areas and cause more chromatic aberrations. How can it be that a lens with such a high distortion also shows so many lateral chromatic aberrations? And shouldn't lenses become cheaper to produce because of the lack of special glass? I don't see that either. I see a visible advantage in terms of sharpness, yes, and of course also in terms of design. A 24mm with f1.4 in such a small size wouldn't be possible a few years ago without a digital correction. But why, for example, does Sigma's 24mm 1.4 DGDN doesn't need it at all in the same size and weight of a lens? But just to express that also in numbers, if you screw this Canon lens onto your camera and take pictures with it, 19.4% of the image area of your camera sensor is used to correct the horrendous distortion. And only 80.6% of the area of your camera sensor is used for the actual image capturing. To illustrate this, I highlighted the outside area outside of the actual corrected images in red and then had to calculate which percentage of the image is red. I've also learned over the last years that you can't equate this with a 20% loss of resolution, because the distortion mainly affects the corners and the edge areas. However, right, left, top and bottom are also significantly cropped so that the image sensor area is simply wasted, which you don't actually need to waste if you have a better lens design, like with the Sigma lens I just told you. But yes, in the end, the image would be still sharper with this digital correction. And that is what matters more to many people than the fact that more transparency would be desirable in my opinion. Why not telling people what is going on openly and actively? And for this reason, I can't really evaluate the vignetting either. If I turn the correction profile off, with this extreme distortion, the corners of the image are so far out that they are completely pitch black regardless of the aperture. And as a comparison, like I said, I have experience with Sony's 24mm 1.4G master and Sigma's impressive 24mm 1.4 DG-DN. And just find it very strange what Canon is doing here, because the competition doesn't seem to need it. But let's take a look at the rest of the properties. The flare resistance here is quite embarrassing. In outdoor use, I didn't find it that bad. But with a closer look, here in my test setup with the flashlight, I see a large and noticeable halo circle, quite a lot of ghosting, the lens's own reflections when a light source is in the image, and the behavior with stray light from the side could also be much better. The halo circle is the worst for me here. And as mentioned earlier, this is not necessarily a deal breaker in practice. For example, I made these recordings here for an upcoming video with this lens and have no problem with how it flares or behaved in direct sunlight from an artistic perspective. But from a technical perspective, it's unfortunately not very good. Certainly not at this price. At least the sun stars are quite beautiful with the 11 aperture plates. And there are also no autofocus problems with this lens either. It's fast, it's silent and it's accurate as it should be. And one of these big advantages of these hybrid lenses from Canon is supposed to be that they show no or very little focus breathing compared to the photo lenses and especially the lenses of the competition. And that is at least a real advantage of this lens. By the way, for me personally, ultimately, this was the main argument to buy the 35mm 1.4 VCM because I mainly use it for video. But focus breathing only interests the videographers and not the photographers, who unfortunately have no other choice with Canon's RF lineup if they want something that's more high quality or even weather sealed. In the end, the 24mm doesn't convince me any more than the 35mm. Yes, Canon's hybrid VCM prime lenses are extremely sharp, even wide open over the whole images, and have no or little focus breathing. But even if you say, okay, we look at the image only with the correction profile applied, the lens still struggles with intense chromatic aberration. The bokeh has still the onion rings and appears restless in practice, and the flare resistance is also nothing I would have expected from a Canon L lens with this price tag. However, the lenses are of course pleasantly small and relatively light. But for example, a Sigma 24mm 1.4 DG-DN for half the money is super sharp, shows similarly bokeh but significantly fewer CAs, much less distortion, much better flare resistance, but unfortunately it's not available for Canon's RF mount and has extreme focus breathing, but that will not bother the photographers at all. In the end, the results from Canon's 24mm 1.4 VCM are of course not the problem, as I told you. You can and will be able to take great pictures and videos with it. For me, however, the question is how far the optical performance justifies the price. And here I see considerable discrepancies between the cost and the performance, because it doesn't really offer more value than sharpness and no breathing. Everything else is worse than with the competition. That will be enough for many, yes, but for you to take an informed decision as well, I make such videos just to tell you. If you think the Canon RF 24mm 1.4 L VCM is for you, or you simply say to yourself, I have no other choice in Canon's ecosystem, Then you will find links under the video in the video description, and if you buy through these links, you support this channel free at no cost to you and ensure that I can continue to make such videos for you, even if Canon probably won't want that for the VCM lens lineup, if it's really this pattern for all of them. But feel free to tell me what you think about it. Write it in the comments under the video. And if you liked the video, leave a like under the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit the bell if you don't want to miss any other video from me. Otherwise, here are 2 more videos that you can watch afterwards, because that's it from me for today, and I would say bye until next time.